I think you're going there, because when you keep adding a qualification on the abstract level, that's like huge to me. Mm-hmm. Like that's not just a addition. Like, and I think I'm starting to think for you, it's also a huge deal to say that, right?
Well, I think that's the whole point of my project of monotheism, was to say this doesn't make sense on the abstract level, and yet we still exist. Mm-hmm. And so somehow or other, what doesn't make sense at the abstract level is possible in the real world.
Welcome to Grow Country. My guests today are J.D. Lyonhart and Jordan Daniel Wood. Both of them have been guests on Grow Country before. And they're here today because they are two of the speakers that we're going to have at the Southeastuary conference that's coming up. And we thought it would be a good idea to kind of like get the pump prime for the conversation they're going to have there. And also to kind of promote the conference and remind you all that it's coming up and you should get your tickets. I believe the Mountain View Lodge is sold out. But there are still quite a few options in terms of like Verbo Airbnb type options in the area of Lake Junaluska, so you can still join us, and there are still tickets available. And the dialogue that we have thrown these two fine gentlemen into is going to be a dialogue on the paradox of being and becoming. And it is my fault that is the topic, and the reason that's the topic is because I noticed that it is something that both of them have dealt with in their respective theological work. So I've brought them together today to talk to us, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to actually ask JD to open the conversation today, and to kind of like, because I know like in your book Monotheism, you kind of like you kind of hinted at it and started to gesture toward it a little bit without really getting into it. So I'd like to hear to give you a chance to like more fully develop your thoughts that were kind of just like starting to lean a particular way in that work.
Yeah, towards the specific question of being and becoming, or just in general, just vomit up the whole book. No. I think the heart of the book was we keep coming across these mysteries that repeat themselves, whether it's in the Trinity, whether it's in subject and object, body and soul, time and eternity. And I think the discussion, whether it's in philosophy, theology, or even in science, just sort of hits a point where it breaks down over and over again. And not just like, oh, the modern project hasn't figured it out yet, but like these are perennial questions that go back thousands of years. The ancient philosophers were dealing with it. The church fathers were dealing with it. And when these kind of enigmas come up, I think often we think, well, therefore the thing that I believed in must be stupid. We must throw it out. It's ridiculous. And I think the core of my book was, well, the Trinity looks this way. It looks like it doesn't make sense. And free will also looks like it doesn't make sense. But then when you look at the origins of the universe, it also doesn't make sense. And the more I started to put those into conversation, the more I realized these are actually not different conversations. They're kind of the same conversation. And it's the same philosophical puzzle that reappears in different guises in each of these contexts. And so I started to make those connections. And then I realized it wasn't even three enigmas at all. It's the same enigma. For Christians have traditionally always believe that the triune God freely created the cosmos, not out of necessity, but freely, ex nihilo. And so the idea that these were ever three separate discussions for me collapsed in this sense that this is the same discussion. And if the enigma of the Trinity and of free will is the same conceptual, unsolvable enigma of our own existence, then does the Trinity and does free will become as rational to believe in as the fact that we're here? In which case it's as rational as, anything. And so that's kind of the argument of the book. And I could flesh out some of those connections more, and I'm sure the discussion will. But I'd also say that it's not just a cosmogenical point. It's not just about the origins of the universe that I draw this parallel. I would say this parallel is in ontology. And I think the enigmas are there in my work. I think they're also there in Jordan's work. I think the attempt to solve these enigmas is precisely what in some ways distinguishes David Bentley Hart's work and Jordan's work, because they're doing it in different ways. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I don't think it's just the origins of the universe, but it's ongoing ontology. For me, the relationship between being and becoming, and also between oneness and manyness, and how oneness and manyness come together, for me, that's at least from abstract logic's perspective, it's unsolvable. And yet we do exist, and oneness and manyness somehow cohere in a unified universe of manyness. And I think Jordan and I would both ultimately say that's a Christological thing. And that Christ somehow holds that oneness and manyness being and becoming together. And I think the interesting parallel might be, we don't just say that about the incarnation, but I think we also both say it about creation itself, the origins of the universe, because it's not just the incarnation that brings those things together. It's the creative act through which all things were made for Jesus. And so there's a parallel between who Christ is 2,000 years ago and the origins of the universe. And then I think the differences begin to manifest from there. But I think those are some of the parallels, and I think that's the basic structure of what I propose in my book, Monotheism.
Thank you. That's interesting that you kind of hit on the on ontology, because we just had the T-shirt that I'm wearing is from the Midwestuary conference that we just had in Chicago. So it's part of the same kind of thing that the one that's coming up that you guys are going to be part of. And John, the cognitive scientist John Vervaeke, who I've had Jordan in conversation with before, was one of the speakers at that conference in Chicago. And one of the things he talked about is that is his conviction that moving forward, theology is going to become important again. And he quite specifically said that theology is going to become important in that it's going to have to begin to formulate new ontologies. Mm-hmm. And that's what's going to allow theology to kind of like to fill in gaps in areas where it hasn't been able to be successful before, is by developing these new ontologies. And so I think very much like you've already kind of set us in that direction, JD, with your introduction about what the lines of thinking were in your work. So the two of you have already kind of started working in that area that John has pointed out is going to be the field of theology future. What would your reaction be to that, Jordan?
Ooh, there's a lot of places we could go from there, which is good. It's a good sign, right? It means it's like an important area. So a few thoughts come to mind. One is that I will have read Monotheism by next month. Whereas I haven't yet. I saw early drafts of it a long, long time ago, but that's not fair because, that's not the book.
You saw the very first draft
in
2010.
Yeah.
You're the first person to tear it apart.
And what's funny is at the time I was more of like a Wittgensteinian. And so I was like,
do we want to take an aside to establish for the audience, like the fact that you guys know each other?
Yeah, let's do it.
Do a little bit of it. Yeah, let's go ahead. If you want to give the history of the connection.
So both of us come, well, actually, I think I've learned both from you, John, and Seth. You weren't necessarily raised like in the Restoration movement, is what it's called, or the Stone Campbell movement, but we all did end up at a Bible college called Ozark Christian College, rural Missouri, southwest of the state, corner of the state. My brother actually still works there, teaches there in New Testament, and Nate, you've had him on, you've discussed his book, and So certainly, like, my family's pretty embedded in that tradition. But anyway, we all ended up there. I think we've said before, like, the tradition is very much biblicist in the sense that there's no official creed, there's no official central organization. It's congregationalist. There's really nothing other than like, let's read the Bible and try to understand it together on the essentials. And so that Bible college was a lot of the biblical text. And then there were like little pockets of us that were trying to think about other things too, besides just, the Greek text of the New Testament or whatever. John, you came a little later. I came to Ozark in 2005 and I stayed until 2010. When did you come?
I came in 2007, and
Right.
Jordan was already one of the cooler older kids that we were all trying to be like, so I just would be like, "Hey, let's go get pizza," and he's like, "Okay," and so I kind of annoyingly clawed onto him a little bit and forced him to talk to me, and it's really funny because I was more philosophical and creating these big systems, and he, as he said, he was more into this Wittgensteinian kick where he was just saying, "No, you can't talk about anything. Just pass over it in silence."
Exactly.
And now he's doing all the metaphysics, and I'm like, you douchebag. But we had one class. We had one class, which was where I worked out the first version of the idea that later became monotheism. And it was super amateurish. I was just throwing a bunch of ideas into a paper, and Jordan was the reader for that. And so he's literally the first person who teared a new one in the idea. So.
Yeah, but from like a Wittgensteinian perspective. However, I think one of the times when we went out for pizza, I think it was definitely post the class, where after the class I was doing the critique or whatever. I think even then I had because yeah, it's not worth getting to my whole thing with Wittgenstein. I mean, John and I think both had this in common, that we were always trying to basically forge our own path through the curriculum and so forcing them to like allow us to do basically whatever we want. So John, I feel like you had like parts of your project that later became monotheism. You're basically like not recycling, because that sounds like you're just cheating, but like you're always like trying to work on the system in whatever class you're in. So you were trying to do an angle, making it fit for the paper.
Your brother gave me a C- on that paper because it was so not what the topic of the class was about.
This is so funny. This is great background. And so I would do that too, right? So like I convinced the dean to allow me to basically, instead of taking the philosophy requirement, I didn't really want to take it with the person that was teaching it, to just do an independent study. My brother was sort of adjuncting there at the time. He knew nothing about Wittgenstein, but I was like, he's gonna lead me in an independent study of Wittgenstein. And so anyway, they signed off on it. I literally just read all of Wittgenstein, I think, except the lectures on mathematics, and I gave this like presentation over Wittgenstein to the faculty at the end of the semester. And that was my philosophy course.
He sat at the back of the room, turned his back, and didn't say anything.
I said nothing. I started reading Rilke or something. No, but so I was like, yeah. So anyway, I was in the midst of that kind of furor when I first encountered John's work. Now we're meeting years later, and I'm basically a Hegelian. So things will be interesting. Yeah. So anyway, I think a few things come to mind. One is that, I'll definitely read the book. The other thing is that one thing that I've been thinking about a lot constantly is that the way that the patterns recur, because that's one of the things with John's thing, is he's trying to say, look, we're seeing the same pattern in these different areas of philosophy of religion or whatever, and I think that's right. I would almost wonder if the patterns don't recur even more ubiquitously, almost like in the realm of hermeneutics, like say just as an example, when Plato tries to make the argument that we have knowledge in our souls that we could not have experienced from this world because they're the presuppositions by which we understand and experience this world, so it's evidence of immortality. Or when Aristotle says in like De Anima that or for that matter in Posterior Analytics, where he's talking about science is this automatically begins with this, I can't remember the exact phrase he used in the Analytics, but it's essentially something like it's a certain sort of sketch knowledge. And what it is you're already, as it were, you're embarked with the paradox. The paradox is the condition for any further explanation, because you have to have enough of a sense of the essence of the thing you want to know in order to map out a method by which you can know it, because the method has to match the nature of the thing you want to study, or else you will be studying something else. So you have to have a sense from the beginning of like I don't know, it looks to me like a little esquisse or outline of being, like a being, a certain essence, an ousia. And yet you only have that in view of the increase of science, of knowledge of that thing, further understanding its determinations, really getting the content of the essence that you initially sketched. So what's so fascinating about that, and somebody like Hegel will come along and exploit, especially because Kant gives him a real reason to do that, is he'll say, well, so then it must be the case that at least in that realm, and even in the Aristotelian endeavor to know the nature of things, you already have the being of the thing present at the beginning of a becoming, becoming more and more intimately knowledgeable or familiar with a thing that you only have a sketch of. And yet if you fully complete that and you have a really secure episteme, that sort of knowledge, all you've really done is return to the initial sketch. You've just filled out the content, though. So being and becoming, even in the realm of subjectivity or of science or of methodology or epistemology, it's like I see a similar. So how do they relate exactly, right? Hegel's going to point out that they relate as mutually determining, which is to say, which a little upsets our initial presuppositions, because it's like we think if something is true, really true, it can't change. That's the whole thing with immutability, aseity, and all that. So then how is it that I can come to know the thing that can never change, but I must come to know it? Right. And so here we are again. I'm just saying, so this is another example where it seems like we're out of ontology in a way. I mean, I understand that's not necessarily the case, but an epistemological endeavor, an endeavor to know something better, but you have to begin and end, as it were, in the same paradox. And so so it's like so modern thinkers will exploit that and say that's evidence that all you really know is your self-knowing, right? So when we conceptualize being and becoming, we're already just we're just reflecting on the structures of our own mind, not necessarily getting at the world as it is. Well, if you're a sort of idealist, that's not an absolute either or. So I think like that kind of pattern is showing up all over the place. And then as a Christian, like as someone who wants to think through this through Christology, ultimately, then you have the choice to decide whether or not you're going to do like an existentialist leap of faith or a fideism, or if you want to try to articulate something like an expansion of reason itself so that it's not irrational, but it's also not simply conforming to, as John put it, the abstract. You said something right, like the abstract understanding.
Yeah, abstract logic.
Yeah. That's, I think, another point where we converge quite a bit, because I do agree with that moment. And that does, I think, in some ways distinguish us from like David Hart, sometimes his inclinations.
Well, I'm glad you think that, because my whole thing here is to tack my star to yours. And as you rise, to just sort of grab onto your heel like Jacob and Esau and try to get carried with your glory. I hope that's clear.
I can't say that's a foolish thing to do. No, just kidding. Just kidding.
Sorry, you were gone. I interrupted you.
I don't think I have. I mean, that's not very well worked out anything. It's just trying to like map a little bit the points where I do think we have quite a bit of resonance. I do think, just to end it on this note, why not? Because it's relevant to other discussions. I think, for example, if you're going to say that the best way to understand the fact that Christ has two natures is actually just to end up saying, really, there's only one nature, then I think that you've actually for fear of being an irrationalist, you've become a bad rationalist. And then it makes it less Christologically interesting to me when that happens. So and on that point, I'm closer to what I think John is already doing in other realms, and then a little more distant from like Hart. Although I still hold out that I don't think there's an absolute opposition there, but it's just the way it's been framed so far, as it seems as if there is.
Can I respond to some of that, or are you moderating, Nate?
Oh, go for it.
Yeah, I would say I think we both have a sense that if you're approaching it like Kant, you're going to end up with these inevitable antinomies between all, and reality is not going to make sense. And then I think we also both agree that then you need to kind of go with Hegel and be like, yes, it doesn't make sense, but even to have this conversation, you're already assuming you've overcome this somehow, that reality and the here and now has triumphed over whatever this confusion is. So let's just proceed anyway. Mm-hmm. And so I definitely, that's very fundamental for me, because I don't think I don't think the existence of the universe makes sense, but we're freaking here. And I'd also say that for me, one of the things that doesn't make sense is how we can know the unknown. And yet we do speak about things that we don't yet know. We talk about God as other, and yet we talk about him. You are other for me, and yet I also know you. This is one of the, I mean, this might get into the hermeneutical thing, but this is also part of what doesn't make sense. And yet we proceed and believe as if we actually are able to come to know things, that the unknowable world that is other from us is yet graspable using our finite categories and language. And my projection of myself onto you might mean that, yeah, I'm seeing myself in you, but I still think I can see you, and I still think we can know the world. And so self and other is part of the knowledge thing. And so I would say part of the paradox is precisely our ability to know what shouldn't be knowable and to make sense of the mystical. And so for me, part of the assumption is that the mystical and the rational do come together. And they have to, or else we can't say anything, or all conversations are impossible. So like when I say everything is mysterious and no one understands it, I also believe that my ability to articulate that and for me to rationally grasp what I just said and to have it have content is only possible because it's mysterious and beyond my understanding, but I'm able to still say it. And so the not understandable is understandable. And I think that's Christological. I think it's Trinitarian, because I don't think the Father is the Son, but I think through the Word, we have seen the Father. And so we know God in his fullness, and yet the Son also isn't the Father, and he's distinct from the Father. And so he's mysterious, he's other, he's still beyond us, and he's also not just the Son who we've seen, and yet through him we've seen the Father. And I think, for me, maybe that gets into some of I think in the past, it might have seemed like I think we had a conversation a few weeks ago over the phone, over Facebook Messenger, the horrible audio format, where it seemed like maybe I was saying you can't understand it. And I would say from the realm of abstract logic alone, you can't. But I think we both make that move to, well, what we're actually living through is not just abstract logic, but where it meets reality. Yeah. And I don't think it makes sense that finite beings can talk about the infinite. I don't think it makes sense that rational categories apply to the transcendent. And yet the fact that it does is part of the mystery. And the fact that I can state the mystery is what makes it rational. And the rational and the mysterious come together. And I think in a Hegelian way, they were never anything on their own to begin with.
Right. And that's where, and I think that's an important clarification, because the thing it can sound like, and I'm not saying that you're saying this, but it can sound like, well, the best we can know is sort of purely negative knowledge. We come up to a Kantian moment, which I do happen to think the Kantian moment is more or less essential. But then like what we do is sort of, and this is where like David will be afraid, or Milbank or whoever, where it's like, okay, so what then? By your will, you just transition to the mystical beyond the rational? And now all the terrors of Scotus and voluntarism and all this, now we've sort of conceded the whole game, and actually the heart of everything is simply just a sheer reasonless, groundless will. And then let's go, oddly read well, I won't get to that sidetrack. But anyway, so like that's kind of the fear, right? But that was my initial question, was whether or not you're doing something like that. But I think as we've talked, I'm not sure you are. And what I would want to say is Hegel's critique, and for that matter, some of Schelling's critique of Kant, leads to an interesting moment where, and Soloviev picks this up, and the Russian sociologists pick this up, all this is that you wouldn't want to characterize the critique of Kant's criticism simply as negative, because it's a determinate negation, right? It's a determinate critique. Here's what I mean more specifically. It's to call the antinomies limits is an interpretation of the mind's meeting a resistance beyond which it can't go. But there's nothing about that resistance, free or necessary, time or eternity, right? These things. There's nothing about that resistance that self-interprets as I am an absolute limit. In order for you to call it an absolute limit, you have already exceeded it. And so if you exceed it and you say this is a limit, then the question is, who is the one perceiving it as limit? And shouldn't it be the case that the perceiver there is in some sense beyond the limit in order to imbue it with the meaning or the signifier limit? And so what's the result of that sort of critique? I mean, there's a lot of details there and other things, but let's just say that's where they sort of end up. And some of them will point to Kant's third critique and be like, well, he has this sense in the aesthetics that beauty is some sort of contact with the supersensible substrate or whatever. However they end up running it, it's interesting because on the one hand, there's a lot of agreement with Kant's negative moment. And that's how I think you sound sometimes and the way I sound sometimes when I'm debating like Hart. But then like there's also a kind of determinacy to it, right? It's not just a void. Yeah. It's not just we reached our limit. No, it's a properly defined transition. And this is what I like. That's what I think Hegel's actually doing, like say in The Science of Logic, and people misread that as if it's some kind of ontology or something. No, he thinks that you can develop even from within abstract logic, if you think through the content of the abstraction clearly enough, and you can judge whether or not he does, you can actually come up to as he says at the end of at the beginning of the logic, he says this about the phenomenology. He says, what we really did was establish the idea of absolute knowing. That doesn't mean you've reached it, but you've established the possibility of it, and almost in a sense, the possibility of the necessity of it from within the limits. Now, theologically, if I were going to interpret all that, I would say, in other words, is God limited by God's own unlimitedness, so to speak? And I would say no, and that this is what the incarnation is sort of all about from one perspective. That God can be limited, or to quote Maximus, he can become a symbol of himself. He is the symbol and the symbolized. He is the oneness of the two. Yes, in a different way, though. And that's where the transition does have to happen to a more positive expansion of reason into Vernunft for the idealist, or to love for the kind of mystical Christian theological tradition or something like that. That love then is not simply in opposition. It's in a sense, it's an opposition to knowing as understanding, but it's not like abstraction, but it's not an opposition to knowing itself. In fact, it's the completion or perfection of it. And so that's sort of, anyway, that's sort of where there are two different ways to run it, but I don't know.
Yeah. I think, and feel free to grab the reins here anytime, Nate. I'll just keep going, but I think there's multiple.
As long as
we're on topic.
As long as we're on topic, I'm fine.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about space. No, so I think when we're bringing David Bentley Hart in this,
DBH.
The critique that in somehow like we're just having a void here, or it's like a theistic move. I think a huge part of monotheism is I break down the major options from abstract reason's perspective of just all being, all becoming, or some paradox of both. Mm-hmm. And my sense is that his view is no more rational at an abstract level than ours is, or anyone's is. And I think there's the sense that if you're just going to kind of go with the monistic with sort of oneness, then he tries to also shovel in some of the manyness. Right. And try to make sense of that, and that assumes that categories like
modes.
Yeah, when you assume that categories like mode and substance already make sense. I don't think they do. I think you can only get into mode, substance, language if you've already assumed that unity and diversity, oneness and manyness are somehow held together in the bothness that I describe in the book. Like, and I'd say the same thing for finite and infinite. I don't think infinity's. I don't want to say infinity is impossible in reality, but I don't think it's coherent to abstract logic. And the idea that he thinks that embracing the infinite gives him an ability to bring the finite along with it without negating it, but it's still one. I just don't think that makes sense. I think it might be true, but it's not more coherent than just allowing two natures to be in one person, because unity and diversity and manyness and oneness can just come together in some way that might not make sense at the abstract level, but kind of just does in lived experience. And I think my sense is he's assumed that mode and substance are valid categories, because how could they not be in your lived experience. So he's already made that move in order to get those categories, in order to justify that, he's somehow more rational in that. But I think mode and substance already assume that unity and difference have to come together in some way, or else what the hell is a mode of something? True oneness, absolute oneness. If you really want to go there and call that more rational, it's got to be some sort of Advaita Vedanta type thing. And I'm here for that conversation. But even then, I don't think that's more rational, because I think it negates like all of our faculties and experience. And I think it just sacrifices reality for abstraction. But I also think oneness is at the heart of all things, just in conversation with manyness. And that might not make sense, but it makes as much sense as any of these views. So it's not like our view is more irrational than anyone else's at the abstract level, even not even moving to the dialogical type of thing. Just even at the abstract level, I refuse to grant that his view is more rational.
Yeah, well, and it gets even more, for me, it's been a little bit more unclear. Like, for example, once he was asked in a Q&A whether or not when he says mode, he means nature. And he said yes. So if you're going to say that God has two modes, the mode of being and the mode of becoming, such that the human being is God in the mode of becoming, like deification, and then God in the mode of being is whatever classical theism means by the God who is immutable and omniscient and has aseity and so on, then that just is another different terminological way to say God has two natures. And if you're going to say God has two natures, but you would rather say mode, I think for one thing that kind of obscures the difference, but if there is one between us, it can't really be on the level of the same quote unquote subject, God, having two different and abstractly considered opposite modes, natural predicates. What do we want to say? And so, time, eternity, like, so it kind of, in a sense, there's a certain way that sometimes I think a certain system can say just little enough to seem like it's solved what would be surfaced if you said more. Like it's a sort of, I don't know, let's say a very shrewd paucity, rhetorical paucity, that's very useful. And I don't at all attribute any sort of ill intent. I actually think there's a real, I think there's a real understandable motive behind, at some point, can we just sort of step back and kind of get more general and like less in the weeds and technical, because that's when things start branching off and people disagree. And at some point you're just like, are we really saying something different after all? Beyond the 4th century, what do we really need to say about Christology? It's good enough. Chalcedon's of whatever formula, so like the good old days when you just had Origen and, and it's like, hey, I love Origen, as we all know, more than as much as the next person. Well, we can't maybe assume that the next person does, but that isn't really a strategy for me to go back in order to simply not address what was only raised later. And so I think that when you like to take a very concrete example, when Maximus is trying to counter the Miaphysite charge, but not just that, the monenergist charge. It's really interesting because he seems to concede that they have a real, the problem motivating their Formula One energy actually is a real problem that simply isn't addressed by Chalcedon. Because what does it really mean to say, well, look, guys, Jesus was one life, or one incarnate nature or something, following Cyril, following Apollinarius, but when he acts, he's two actualities, energia. What is two actualities except just two people, two different lives, because you can number them now, right? And
they're just relocating the mystery,
right?
Over again.
And they're and they want to say, well, no, we can contract it into here. And Maximus on the one hand says, well, no, because if we contract it, then we're going back on the nature thing. And then that goes back. He's got a whole chain there. But the other thing he's also saying, conceding in a way, or at least recognizing that's a legitimate concern, is, well, hold on. We don't want to say, it is true that we don't want to say that the life of Jesus Christ is ever actually two in the sense of monadically separate, divided. And so if we do just say two actualities, that sounds like two different lives. Like I think he agrees that that could be a problem, which is why he kind of rejects or goes beyond the normal earlier patristic strategy of partitive exegesis. And like, well, look, Jesus here is doing a human thing, and over here he's doing a God thing. And it's different points in this sequence in the gospel story. And, but you can sort of see glimpses of both. And he ends up saying, no. He's always doing a divine and a human thing at the same time. And the fact that he is the one agent doing both at once means that you will perceive them as perichoretically interpenetrating all the time at every single moment, never divided at all. And, I think we should think that both directions because, right, it's not just that every time he does something human, there's also divinity, but every time he does something divine, like create the world, it's got to be done humanly. Yeah. And he says that actually in a letter. But, okay. So, but the point is that's just an example, right? Of that's a real development, like a real internal problem. That's not just a kind of unfortunate detour that created unnecessary divisiveness. It's also not sort of trying to, as it were, subject the spirit or the mind of finesse to the mind of geometry. It's not that either. It's a real issue that you have to address. And so anyway, I think I do admit it's sort of like an inclination or proclivity I have where I basically think that's always happening. Just as much as creation is always unfolding and developing, so too is our ongoing perception of Christ in all of creation. And so I don't really necessarily like that. Like I have a knee-jerk reaction or a visceral reaction to sort of just let's go back to the good old days when the questions weren't yet raised to make it rhyme. So so there's that. So anyway, but I'm with you. I think that Hart's view is no more rational than ours. And then I want to address then the fear, which is this sort of excess, like a almost Sartrean existence before essence, or a sheer sort of void. And this is also a perennial tension, right? Because the thing people love about concepts, one of the things, is that they don't move. Right? They're sufficiently general. So that whatever, even if you disagree about how to apply them to various particular instances, the concept themselves, they don't move, they don't change. So that gives us a sense that we're in contact with something permanent and therefore eternal and good and true. On the other hand, the fact that we have to come to know, and the fact that the truth is unfolding in the actual world as we perceive it and know it, means that it apparently isn't sufficient to just have the stability of the concept in order to get the totality of the real. And if that's the case, then now we're faced with, well, wait, is the real logical? Because it's not subject to the stability of the concept. So then what does that mean? Are we doing this Dionysian sort of bursting forth and it's all just creative randomness and whatever you will or, volunteer? So this is always a tension. And I do recognize that. I simply don't, to not, because I'm going on too long. I just think at some point
you're finding the point as you unfold. That's
exactly. Yeah. It's either the case that the absolute can be relative as absolute and therefore reveal itself as the only possible way that the two are one, but not in a way that annuls the two, what the concept rightly pointed out, but only partially pointed out in its stability. That's incarnation always and everywhere. That would be the way to run that. And then existentially, you run that through love. An interpersonal knowing, and that this is not a not knowing. It's not a consolation prize for failing to get to the heights of universal intellect. It is itself the determination. It's not just the attention to the particular. It's the wedding of the universal and the particular, the being and the becoming, the stability and the dynamism. So somehow you got to get there is what I think.
Yeah. And I think we're not going to grasp it, but I would say that we also do grasp it, and that's the problem.
Right.
But I would say, I think both of us would agree that the categories of being and becoming, time and eternity, oneness and manyness, they if you try to grasp them on their own,
Right.
they don't actually work on their own. They need the other. And I think to try to just go with one side of it and say we've resolved the tension by eliminating all of the facets of existence that don't align with this side of the tension, or somehow making them less real, or, you know, or trying to, I mean, I think DBH is trying to bring the finite along with the infinite.
Yeah.
And I think that's an admirable attempt. But I think the problem is it's not a coherent attempt. Because I don't think infinity makes sense to finite minds. I think a lot of time when we think of what we mean by infinity, we just mean indefinite. But when you actually really do mean infinity, it doesn't quite make sense. And I think mathematicians try to make it make sense. And I think they can pragmatically work with it in their equations, but I don't think they ever explain how it in itself makes sense. And so I don't think just taking one side of the dualism on its own really gets you anywhere. And I think you need both sides, but the problem is when you try to see how those sides come together, I don't think you can think that either. And I think from the abstract level,
Right.
I admit that in reality, they do come together because we do exist in a world that is both stable and unfolding, that where unity and diversity are constantly wedding, not just in a few places, but like in the possibility of this conversation of me as self and you as other, and yet somehow bridge such that we're accessing each other. Like, I think it's just in everything. But I think that still isn't thinkable. And at the abstract level.
Right.
But at the same time, to say what I just said assumes that it already is thinkable and sayable. And so, as you kept saying, you have to proceed with the thing you're trying to get to, assumed in your foundation. Somehow or other, this quest must be possible, or else we couldn't even talk, or else we wouldn't exist.
So then, real quick, and then Nate, I want you to jump in. So it seems like it's one thing to say that it's not thinkable to finite minds, but if the minds are potentially infinite, then insofar as they think themselves, not simply according to their own self-conception, which is necessarily finite initially, but in their infinity, then they'll simultaneously move beyond the initially unthinkable, but also positively and absolutely thinkable. And that is what I think unless we are willing to say we can't think love, or love doesn't think, which I'm not willing to say, then I think I would want to say, you know, and Hegel just makes the distinction between infinite and finite thinking, but you know, it's more complicated than that because he doesn't think of that as simply as conceptions of thinking. But I think that's the direction I want to go. So I think you're going there because when you keep adding a qualification on the abstract level, that's like huge to me. Mm-hmm. Like that's not just a addition. Like, and I think I'm starting to think for you, it's also a huge deal to say that, right?
Well, I think that's the whole point of my project of monotheism, was to say this doesn't make sense on the abstract level, and yet we still exist. Mm-hmm. And so somehow or other, what doesn't make sense at the abstract level is possible in the real world.
But
and
would
so
you
we
say,
need to
and I know I need to read the book, so maybe you can just say go read the book.
No, tear holes in it without no, just do it. I want to see you do that.
This is actually just a clarifying question. It's not it's one thing to say it must make sense because we have evidence that it does, and that's just our sort of current existence, and we are here, and the universe did begin, and so on. Like Kant could say that. Kant does say that. I mean, the point of the antinomies is like freedom and necessity seem to both be valid from our own experience. The fact that we experience both is why we can even conceptualize both, and they both seem to exist, although they can't harmonize conceptually. So, like that, that's one.
I would go
kind
a step
of
further than that.
Okay, that's what I'm asking. Is it? So I think that's important. Are you just saying, you know, somehow it makes sense, or are you saying that there is a way to perceive the sense, though it will not be? Yeah.
I would say that precisely because it doesn't make sense, it can both make sense and not make sense fully at the same time and in the same way. And for me, that doesn't make sense. But does it it doesn't need to make sense, but it also makes sense because I'm saying it. And if it didn't, we wouldn't exist to talk about. Well, let me start again. If you allow, if you allow that this essential paradox is at the heart of existence, part of that paradox is not just ontological, it's epistemological. I can know that which is beyond my categories and understanding. And that doesn't make sense how I can know it, but it makes as much sense as my own existence. And it makes sense. It does. It can be rational and irrational fully at the same time and in the same way. And for me, that's what the Trinity is. I don't think the Father is the Logos, but I think we see the Father through the Logos and not as parts, not like we see part of God. We see all of God. And yet the Father doesn't reduce to who the Son is. And so I think the world ultimately is fully rational, but also it's also fully other and fully beyond me and my conceptualization and categories. And to say both of those things at the same time might not make sense, but it makes as much sense as my own existence. And I think sometimes we imagine that at the top of the ontological hierarchy, there's either reason or mystery. And that if both are up there, one has to be above the other. But why can't they both be up there next to each other? Or indeed in the same place? And then someone will say, no, that's irrational. How could reason and mystery be together in the same place? And I'd say, it's quite mysterious, isn't it? And they would say, what did you just do? And I'd say, well, there's both reason and mystery in the same place at the same time and in the same way. And they would say, that's a contradiction. And I would say, it's very mysterious. And then they would say, well, how can you even talk about it if it's beyond diction, contradiction? And I would say, well, it's also rational. But how is it rational and not rational at the same time and in the same way? And I would just say, I know, it's very mysterious. But as crazy as that sounds, that's what we have to assume is real in order for us to go out and encounter anything. You are other from me. I mean, Plantinga made this point about other minds. All of the problems of how we can know a transcendent God reoccur in how I can just have this conversation with you guys. So like, this isn't a religious theological problem. This is self and other. It's other not just with other persons, but it's other with objects. How can I understand something that's other from me at all? And yet I do think we can understand those things. And it's quite mysterious how we can understand them, but it's also rational at the same time. And I think if you want to say that it has to be, anyways, I'll shut up.
Well, this is the part of the conversation that's very much haunted by our cognitive scientist friend, John Vervaeke, because what he would introduce into this conversation at this point is that a lot of what you're talking about things that are inherent limits to propositional knowing, period. Right? That's why they always end in these paradoxes, is because propositional knowing by its nature just has these kinds of limits by nature of what it is. And there's no way we will ever be able to capture the fullness of the real within a propositional structure. But fortunately, propositions aren't the only way that human beings know things.
Yeah.
Right.
It doesn't make sense in abstraction that I can know my wife who's other from me. And yet I do.
And Esther and Jordan was talking about love. And one of the speakers that's going to be one of the other speakers that's coming to this conference is actually Esther Meek. And Esther Meek is very much like, a brief summary of the primary thesis of her work is that loving and knowing are one and the same thing. And and to try to separate them from one another is just going to lead you into error. And from John's perspective, John Vervaeke, that is, he would want to talk about the other kinds of knowing that we have that he would want to introduce into this, namely the participatory knowing, which is the conversation that Jordan and I had with John in the past, where Jordan was kind of wanting to push on the limits of participatory knowing. So, but in any case, I think that's why you can say that. Like, that's why, yes, our propositions cannot fully capture what we're trying to describe. And one of the reasons for that, by the way, has to do with the infinity of the divine, because our propositions are almost always time bound. It's almost impossible to create a proposition that doesn't have an implicit tense to it. Propositions are almost always bound to linear time by the nature of trying to create a proposition about anything. And so that's one of the reasons. That's one of the reasons that they inevitably trip us up and lead us into these irresolvable paradoxes. So that's all I'd want to say is that, like, I think you're right. We can know these things. It's just that propositional knowing isn't the way that we're going to achieve it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so then I would. Right, because even if you like say tried to convert propositions, as some analytic philosophers have tried to do, into explicitly tenseless claims, your point would still be, I would think, is that the proposition itself is laid out sequentially.
Yep.
And so even if there's no tense referred to exterior to the proposition, the fact that you have to use subject, verb, predicate,
bingo, is
already a say an imminent temporality. So right, the B series is still temporal in that sense. And so I think like that is very much, again, because it kind of does remind me again back to like Aristotle's point where, I mean, you could put it this way, that if you have to begin to know, then the knowing that begins is already limited, therefore finite, because it had a starting point that isn't simply identical with the absolute. And yet if the absolute is the thing you're trying to know, then the absolute either is unknowable by a thing that must begin to know it, or the absolute somehow includes the knowing itself of itself in itself as absolute. Like those are the things. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I guess if you just allow genuine unity and to overcome diversity and to like hold manyness and oneness in tension, you can say that a nature apart from another nature can somehow be bridged in the knowing process. Like, I just don't see the problem. I there is a problem, but it's not more in this theory than anything else, right?
I mean, I think the problem would be the subject that has to begin to know. If what it has to know is itself infinite, then either its knowing the absolute would eradicate itself as subject that had to begin. Therefore, where is the knower? Or it's an asymptotic approach and it never fully knows, but therefore retains its, as it were, distance or tension, and therefore its determination as having begun. So I do think there's an actual like inherent logical. I'm not saying it's not a contradiction. It depends on what you postulate as the goal. If your postulation is total knowledge of the absolute, and yet you do admit with Kant and stuff that you can never get the plane off the ground without the wings of finite concepts and particular intuitions, then I think you're going to end up either in an Evagrian or Advaita absorption type thing. And I'm not saying everyone in that tradition said whatever, but
I think think the issue is not what they say, but where their ideas
where it goes. So it's either that or you simply, and I actually think that was more speaking from just the Christian tradition, that was a little more tempting for at least the Eastern Alexandrian tradition of Christianity in the first 700 years. That option, let's just be a drop in the ocean of divinity. Lose the qualities of your finitude and separate in order for you to sort of be at one with the ocean of divinity, that kind of stuff. It was certainly a tension, and it was addressed and called out and fought over. But I actually think today it's more popular or more common, even among theologians, to think that the asymptotic, or you might say the analogical or the participatory, sort of satisfactorily secures my identity as the subject who had to begin at all. Therefore, my identity's, but I'll just sort of sacrifice the unity so that I'm never fully God, right? That's why out of all the patristic sort of people in the Alexandrian tradition, the one those people like is Gregory of Nyssa's epectasy, even though I think it's a little more complicated what he actually meant there, but they like the image, always a striving and becoming one, never arriving. So you get to preserve your identity because you absolutize distance. Mm-hmm. You get to be yourself because you're never the thing you're trying to know, the absolute. But then, okay, the Hegelian critique on all that is to say, okay, but you have absolutized something. You do think you know what the absolute's like because you know a condition for the absolute and the non-absolute, namely the distance. You've made that a condition, and you know that that's a condition. Therefore, that's an absolute concept, right? So this is just where I think. So where I want to go with all this is I'm somebody who's Hegelian but a personalist.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think I actually would argue that a consistent Hegelian would end up as a personalist of some kind, which is why Kierkegaard's not a complete turn away from Hegel. But I think that depends on how you characterize this tension between the absolute and the relative. It does, and so that would be where the discussion would have to go.
Yeah, I think. It's interesting that you bring up analogy, because I think one of my convictions has always been that analogy either doesn't work or it's a contradiction, or at least it seems like a contradiction and isn't in some way that's just utterly beyond my understanding. Because I think if it's not a contradiction, it's basically a rational mixture, and then you can dissect the parts into univocal and equivocal parts. Just like H2O can be broken down into hydrogen and oxygen because they're not a contradiction, they're just a mixture. But I think the reason I've stuck with the language of contradiction so often, and I would say a seeming contradiction, is because I recognize that there's something ridiculous in saying the distinction is absolute difference, but also to say that we're absolute oneness, it doesn't work either for me. And I don't think it's conceptually better nor experientially better. And so I just sort of end up saying, well, it has to somehow be some combination of both, fully different and fully the same. And not just as an analogical attempt to mix those things and have it be part the same and part different, but actually like these things are standing in the same place at the same time and in the same way, such that oneness and difference are actually united, but also different, and not united in some ways and different in others, because then you could scalpel them out again. But actually the unity is the difference and the difference is the unity at the same time and in the same way, such that I could say, yes, I am never going to be fully God and never going to fully know God. And yet I also fully know God and am fully one with God. And that doesn't make sense. But again, it makes as much sense as our own existence or as any of this conversation to me. And so it allows me to hold both absolute difference and absolute oneness. And I think anyone who only affirms one side of that is missing part of the Christian tradition. And we can argue about what exactly it means to be in the middle there. But I do think we both have some sense that the middle, like there's something in that tension. But then I wonder, when it comes to deification, for example, why you can't see my point about, yes, we are fully one with God, but also fully not. Or maybe you are, and that's just what deification is for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would depend on a few things. One is that I think, I still think if all we end up doing is just saying two opposite propositions, that I'm not always sure we've left the propositional. It seems like we've just recognized its inherent weakness, but then made that the limit, the weakness itself acknowledged. And so this is where sometimes the move with like, it makes sense and it doesn't make sense. I am all one and I am all many. And I don't know what that means, which already seems to be actually, you don't think it just makes sense and makes sense, but it actually kind of more doesn't make sense.
Or maybe I do know what it means and I don't know what it means at the same time and in the same way.
But even that, when you say it's the same, for me, it's the same problem. It's sort of like, it's like concepts realizing that they're insufficient, but then just sort of bumping into each other, not knowing where to go. And I still think though that you wouldn't have any urge if there wasn't some sort of weight tilt towards actually it's mystery that's kind of winning. And I think for that you acknowledge that, but the way you sort of ground it is by sort of just referencing the brute fact of the result. Like, here we are. But then that sort of feels like an extrinsic appeal. like we were going on this track and we started to realize the sort of inherent I would just say the inherent finitude of concepts, right? Like, so it's just that, yeah, the infinite is a negation of the finite, which means that it isn't perceptible apart from its own conditioning in relative to the finite. So the concept of the infinite is itself finite. The concept of the finite is itself finite. Them together is a finite relation. And so we're recognizing all that and we're on the same page and we're going and going and going. But then when we get to the part where it's like, and I don't know how this makes sense, although it also makes sense, saying that it makes sense without an explanation for how it makes sense, right, would just be then a claim that doesn't have a whole lot of content. Or if it does have content, I think you're tipping towards the actually it really doesn't make sense, and that's really what I want to emphasize, which is why I extrinsically appealed to this, to like evidence that shows somehow it does, but I can't tell you how. And so I think that's the part where I'm still like hesitant. And for me, what I want to say is, I think what we've done there is we've basically stalled out on the level of abstraction. And this is why I think there's no other way to do it except to run it through an actual event. And the actual event is the incarnation of God in history. And then, though, here's the weird thing about that. The weird thing about making the content Christ, the content of this whole sort of how does it make sense and not make sense, making that Christ, is that it doesn't simply become a new foundation for a new foundationalism or the foundation of an anti-foundationalism. What it actually does is it just becomes itself the revelation of the mystery that was always you. Mm-hmm. And that is, and so then I don't actually think it doesn't make sense from that perspective. This is why the thing about it makes sense and doesn't make sense in the same way, in the same place or whatever. I'm not sure about that, because when I look at my daughter and I love her, that actually does make sense to me profoundly. In fact, it makes more than sense. Mm-hmm. So, but, and that's a knowing.
I just want to interject something really quick, because that since we've been going down this path that put this kind of into my mind. So Tom Berg in Meditations on the Tarot, Letter 9, he talks about the three fundamental antinomies of philosophy, and in dealing with those antinomies, what he suggests is that each one of those requires a synthesis that is necessarily a personal one. He doesn't really elaborate much on why it must be a personal synthesis, but he is like, it's got to be a personal synthesis. And I think, like, and Jordan, you talking about, no, somehow we really can know these things while gesturing back toward the person. At the same thing, that just reminded me of that passage from Meditations.
Yeah. Well, and I'd say, I mean, what I come to in my book is, I say the ultimate mystery of all things is the personal. That's an exact quote from my book.
Yeah.
And so for me, that is grounded in Christ. And then it's also seen in the origins of the universe through Christ, who's the one who made all things, through him. And I mean, yeah, I do think I know it. I think I'm trying to articulate it in an abstract logic level, precisely to articulate the limits and then tell us to come back down to reality where logic meets the earth. And I think in Christ, it is there. I still think abstract logic has its place, but I don't think it's the ultimate end of all things. Right. Totally. And I think for me, maybe I'm trying to say that even on the level of abstract logic, a lot of these theories that critique the Christological fail even at the abstract level. It's not just that we retreat from the abstract to here. It's that no one makes any more sense than anyone at this level. Which is precisely why you have to have the Christological and the personal. And in seeing my child, I do see that it all works, that my love is both self and other, and that they are genuinely other. And I'm not going to control them and dominate them and make them just a mere extension of myself, but that somehow they are other, but also self, and that we have a unity and a distinction. And that only breaks down if we go back to abstraction, but in terms of the relationship, it's there, and it's love, both in upholding their otherness and unifying it through the love. And I think I think we're very similar in that emphasis upon the reality. And I think the very move to, but we actually exist, is also that for me.
And
Not
because
just in the bare existence.
right, JD,
Yeah.
because how do we exist? We exist as persons. Like
Yeah.
we
There's no other. Yeah.
we have a specific
Yeah.
mode of existence, which
Well,
I
Yeah.
don't
So,
know.
Oh, go
so
ahead.
yeah,
Go
I
ahead.
think for me, go ahead, Nate. Sorry.
Have either of you read David Walsh at all?
A little bit. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So David Walsh, I've been reading David Walsh lately, and David Walsh in his book, The Politics of Person is the Politics of Being, he argues that that personhood itself, even in the finite mode, is actually also beyond being.
Absolutely. Right.
By the nature of personhood.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, this is like, so I think two things with John, your thing. I have wondered about this for a little bit. I do think sometimes I wonder if our language differs because of the approximate interlocutors. Like, I do get a sense that sometimes one of the things you're trying to do is a little bit apologetical. And I don't mean that at all disparagingly. I don't think that's a disparaging term, but like there is a sense in which you do sometimes, at least especially as you talk about it. Again, I'm going to read the book. We'll see. It's different maybe in the book, but it seems like, okay. Well, still I'll read it, but it does seem like, right. I mean, you are trying to sometimes park on a negative moment to make a point to those, as you just said, that would critique. Right. And as if theirs is the rational position, according to this abstract conception of rationality, and ours is just the retreat into kind of whatever. And so that's a real work. Like, that's a real target. Like, but it does explain a little bit of a difference of like landing, because for me, what feels to me like a kind of moment of extrinsic will, we're here. If your goal is, and my interlocutor needs to admit we're also here, therefore we're on the same footing. If that's the goal, well, then that's achieved, right? Then you've got it. Now, when I'm thinking Christologically, I want to say, well, that's a moment. And the moment has integrity. I mean, that's always the point of calling it a moment, is that it has its own integrity, therefore its own proximate use. And so I do think, like, sometimes the way you're framing is much more sort of dominated by that use. The use of saying, those that appeal to abstract logic somehow can, just by that appeal, show, like, undermine everything we're saying or whatever, right? From the Christian perspective. Like, it's kind of like, it reminds me a little bit of like when I'm doing Christology stuff and somebody's trying to critique the Christology and they're like not a Christian at all or whatever. One thing they kind of don't realize is like, hey, the point of the incarnation is not to say that well, so this is the part too where I might kind of, maybe David Hart and I, he might not like this, but I would just say the claim is not that divinity is humanity any more than the claim is that finitude is infinitude. The claim is that Jesus Christ is divine and human. Those are not the same. Even on the level of sort of abstract formal logic or something, like to predicate of a subject, two different, this is Byzantium, contrary predicates. He makes the explicit point. The only thing that can bear contrary predicates is an actual subject. It would be an illogical contradiction by any canon of, law of non-contradiction or whatever, to say the infinite is the finite, period. The square is the circle, period. Right? Okay, no, it isn't. Like, that doesn't mean anything. But if you say this existence is square and circle, you might still think that's nonsense, but that's not the same kind of nonsense as saying a square and a circle are the same. And so the kind of ontology of the subject, as well as the phenomenology of the subject, but the sort of the mystery, the present and available and accessible mystery of the subject, of the person, as one that can bear contrary predicates and qualities and properties that thought on their own are contrary, at least, if not even contradictory, is not the same thing like as how those predicates relate to the subject which bears them. And that's kind of that's the move where it's like, I would also want to have a moment like yours, even just in technical Christology, to say, look, that isn't correct. If you're objecting to the incarnation because you say, well, God must be eternal, Jesus Christ was in time and temporal, therefore that's impossible. Well, you haven't really grasped the claim of the incarnation if you think that's a good argument against the incarnation. And so I see a similar thing moving there. It's just that I then also in Christology want to add the kind of return to the personal and the interpersonal through Christ, through the body, through love ultimately, and say, and that's also in its own way accessible even to somebody that's not a Christian. And so this is, and I don't think you don't want that. So that's the part where I'm like kind of just sussing out, like, what's the, maybe we're just kind of coming at it in different ways. We have different stresses for different audiences. I don't know.
No, I think there's an apologetical bent for sure. I think it might start for anyone who just thinks all of this stuff is stupid.
Right.
Well, you also believe a bunch of stupid stuff, including your own existence. So like, let's level the playing field. But I think it does get more intra-theological very quickly because as you said, other theologians are using these types of arguments to deconstruct each other. And I think to some extent, that's exactly what's happening with you and DBH right now. Or in the theological discussion about, well, why it can't be classical or process. We have to pick one of those. Like, I think that's, so it's maybe apologetical in the sense that I think one theological group could say, hey, none of this makes sense, man, when we're at this level of abstraction. But I do think it gets very quickly into like intra-theological discussions among theologians and not just like the external apologetical stuff. But I think we would both agree, and I don't think there's much more to be said about it, that if it just stays at the abstract, there's something missing. And I think the whole move for me is to return to what actually we have, what is given, what is revealed. And I think that's both Jesus, but it's also the realm, like it's this universe itself through which, like through him, which was made. And I think that connection between creation and incarnation really does fit for me into what I've said about Jesus as becoming itself. So yeah, I think that move to what actually is the personal, the immediate, like that's the only realm in which these things can coexist. I think I'm there. I also, though, wonder sometimes that, I mean, the point isn't that it's that and not the abstract. It's that it's those two things come together or reveal that they were never separate to begin with. And so I'm still trying to find a way, I think, not to live in the abstract, but to bring the abstract into closer conversation with lived experience down here and to get those things as close as I possibly can in reality. And maybe the point is those are already close, like maybe the abstract is baked into existence, like the mathematical structure of reality. I don't know. And so you don't need to achieve it. You just have it and go. But I also don't want to sever the abstract from down here precisely because I don't see them as opposites, but as ultimately reconcilable in the real and in Jesus.
Yeah.
And I do think that maybe, I don't know if it has content in the sense at the abstract level, in the sense that you can then go prove more things, but in the sense that you leave knowing why you can't do anything else with it. And knowing that it is both at the abstract level, rational and not rational. And both of those things I feel like at the abstract level are true. And it makes as much sense as anything else. And then, of course, you can't go anywhere with that. That's why we have to actually get back to reality. So,
and when you say it's rational, at that level, it's rational and not rational, would you also just accept saying it is perfectly rational?
Well, that's the point of it being a contradiction. It's not like it's half rational and half irrational. It's fully both. And for me, that's partially the Trinitarian move. It's not like the Son is part God and the Father is part God. The Word, the Logos, is fully God. And so for me, the logical, the Word, like it gets you to the whole thing. And yet at the same time, the Father and Son aren't identical. They're different, and yet they're one. And that's the mystery. And so the speakability of the mystery is part of the mystery, but it is precisely that mystery that's been revealed. And yeah, like that's...
But it does seem like, for example, it's not as if the contradiction conditions the perception of the whole. Like it's not like Christ is both human and divine, perfectly both true. So it's not partially, it's not a mixture in that bad, crude sense. But the only reason why I can really say that is because I simultaneously perceive his hypostasis as distinct in logic from the natures and in phenomenon, of course, like his life-giving sufferings and his human miracles. So I wouldn't even want to characterize that insight into the mystery of the incarnation as well, it's just sort of equally human, equally divine, or equally makes sense and equally doesn't make sense. It actually makes only sense. But the thing that makes only sense will of course be that on a level that the partial perception of sense or not make sense allows, right? So the moving beyond the abstraction also moves beyond the very conditions that created the perception of an absolute contradiction, which was also from abstraction. So I don't want the contradiction to condition the ultimate terminus either. That's sort of so I want to say it's perfectly rational, right? So
it's 100% rational.
It's perfectly rational. It's not
as
if
perfect more than 100%.
It's more than partial.
Yeah, but using the language of partial, you're already assuming a framework that is logical. And the point is, it is like, that's precisely the point. It's not partial. It's not part. It's fully rational and fully irrational. It's not 50% one, 50% the other. It's 100% both.
Right.
And that doesn't make sense. But again, because it's 100% irrational. But I just spoke it.
Right. But you're doing it now, and you're doing it prior to the actual realization of the whole. And so what's true now of the conditions of your speaking is not true of the whole as the conditions of its reality. And if you think that, then you are actually implicitly absolutizing the juxtaposition as if the contradiction is the whole, or at least the condition for the whole. And so I was thinking of 1 Corinthians 13. For now, we know in part, we prophesy in part, but whenever the perfection comes, the partial will be nullified. Yeah. That's a movement for sure. And of course, that chapter ends in love. But to quote Hegel, it's not a real deprivation to be deprived of our deprivations. So I think it's okay to move beyond the contradiction and say that the contradiction itself doesn't condition, it's not a condition of the whole, so that all we can say is it makes sense and it doesn't make sense because everything rests on the and.
I guess I guess I'm just not totally sure what you mean. If you want to mean that lived reality doesn't exist at that level, then okay. But if you're wanting to then describe that reality in words, which you're trying to do right now, like you're talking about your own thing in some distance from just living it, right? There's a level of abstraction there. And once you're entering that level, I see everything you're saying as resulting once again in these contradictions, unless you just sort of say, yeah, but just live, and those don't exist in that realm of living.
Well, I do want to say that there is no abstract resolution to the contradictions, but I also think just a simple juxtaposition is a sort of attempt to resolve it, because you wouldn't even need to say both if you didn't think it was doing something. So the very urge to say, I want to say it both makes sense and doesn't make sense, has behind it the motive that they need to both be said simultaneously. So that's not just a haphazard juxtaposition. That's a very determinate one.
Well, and I don't think it's terribly abstract, because for me, this is again the Trinity. Like this isn't something I just need to say as a philosopher. This is Trinitarian. You think the Word discloses the Father, and yet you also think the Father is distinct from the Son.
Right.
So how are both of those things true? How is it that the rational, the logical, the logos gets you to the Father, but isn't the Father? Unless you're saying somehow this is beyond reason, but also reason isn't, it's not beyond reason. It's kind of both at the same time, almost perichoretically, the rational. And for me, the thing is, this isn't an abstract thing. This is precisely what it means to love, is to love another in their otherness and not reduce them just to an extension of myself and my own categories and my meanness. It's to simultaneously say they are beyond me and my ability to limit them, pin them down, and know them in their entirety. And yet I know my kid, I know my wife. And so the mystery and the rational, the known and the unknown somehow do come together in love. And I do think that a love that didn't make that space would just be an overcoming, almost monistic love, you could say, where like the self just encompasses the other and doesn't give them any otherness at all. And so the other is just swallowed up in, or somehow lesser than the self in some sort of way. Like maybe the self encompasses it and is larger than it. But I think in order to have genuine love, I think you need self and other, both as overcome in their duality and difference, but also as still different. And so because they are beyond me, they are a mystery. They will not reduce to my understanding or categories. But at the same time, in order to even articulate them, to know them, to have anything of them, you have to already have crossed that bridge in some way, which is the whole point with Kant, right? Like you can't even articulate the contours of the noumenal if this is the case, but somehow you can. Right. Somehow you can. And so I would say, when I say it's mysterious and it's rational and irrational at the same time, that's not just some sort of stupid abstraction. That's the very necessary, that's what I mean by love. And when I love my kid, I don't sit down and say, hey, Soren, do you know that you are both beyond me and within me simultaneously? And the duality of our existence, like I don't say that to him, but I manifest it and that mystery and rationality in the embrace of my child who is other and who I will one day have to let go of. He will go out and make decisions I don't agree with, and I have to allow him to be other in order to love him. And if I don't love him in his otherness, I don't love him at all. And so I think this dance is precisely the dance of love.
I still though wonder if you really accounted for the eschatological transfiguration of the conditions that we're abstracting about right now, whether negative or positive. Because so 2 points. One is that I don't think like Jesus is just becoming; he is being and becoming at the same time. He's divine and human. So it wouldn't be right to say, well, look, Jesus is becoming and the Father is being, because Jesus is being and becoming. So he can't be one side of the conceptual binary as opposed to the other, and therefore we're sort of, that to me would be to sort of absolutize our current, in a negative way, our current sort of perception of the limits of reason as understanding or abstraction, and then actually make that Trinitarian. Whereas I want to go the other way. The Trinity is the revelation of the true perfection of reason. And one of the evidences, so one of the features then of perfection of reason is, yes, absolute oneness and absolute distinction. But the Father could never be separate from the Son. And that's not actually a limitation. That's a sign of perfection. The Son could never be, sort of not being, so that he was becoming for a while. That would be a limitation. That's actually not a sign of perfection. I don't think the Father ever let the Son go and make his own decisions contrary to the Father's own will. That's a heresy. I mean, that's so I want the Trinity, the God's self-revelation as Trinity in Christ, to actually tell me what is possible for the personal, tell me what is possible for love and knowledge, not to just verify my negative framing of the limits and the conditions of the abstract and its binaries and antinomies. So I do want to see that we can know that the eschatological transformation of the conditions. So not just going beyond and holding them together, but actually securing. And this is the last point I'll make on this. And it also is relevant to my disagreement with David. I do think one thing I often think about is how a lot of these sort of discussions might have to neither of us want to give up abstraction. We both said that. It's not saying it's a useless or whatever. We're not saying that. But still then formal logic or the conditions of abstraction, or to put it in Kantian terms, reason's own self-perception in its own conditions, which is necessarily finite. However you want to put it, we still have to return to interpreting what those formal truths are. And one way I would say, one way I've distinguished David and I, is that I sometimes think he thinks at the end of the sort of syllogistic argument or the demonstration that the conclusion, since it follows formally, is kind of like, that's it. That's all you need to kind of say in a way. And I don't necessarily always think he does it, but I do think that sometimes it can come across that way. I think an exception is that chapter on the inseparability of persons and stuff. But okay, so whereas I do think like that leaves the existential gap of like, yeah, but what about reality and the unfolding and all this stuff, right? But then the temptation is to just kind of overemphasize the negative then in whatever form. And I think what I want to do is say whatever is formally true is also formally relatively empty. It's precisely why it can follow formally rather than having to deal with the content, which is usually the realm where things are shifting and become. And so the ultimate so it could be the case that in Christ, what we see, if we run all this through that, we see that we reinterpret formal truths as it were promissory notes, or to use the language of the New Testament, like the guarantee of things to come. So it's something like an intuition or an initial contact or a proleptic contact with what will be in the eschaton, what the actual conditions of the eschaton will be. And we're perceiving that, at least initially, yet still somewhat hollowly, in our formal abstract reasoning. So that I can eventually say, for example, like oneness and difference, yes, they will both be absolutely true, but they will be true and they will be one in such a way that the extreme on its own of one or the other will not even need to be possible for them to both be what they are as one. I don't need it to be the case that the Son can wander off from the Father in order to really prove that he's different from the Father. I don't need that. Because I don't need the
possibility of it.
No, I don't need the possibility of evil. I don't need the possibility of evil in order for the infinite good to be infinitely good. Okay. So yeah, I wouldn't. So in that way, I wouldn't.
Yeah. Sorry, were you done? I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I'm done. I'm done.
Well, I'd say a couple of things. I think the eschatological is something I very much agree with, and something I consistently use in my terminology is seeming contradiction. Right. Because my point is not this is a contradiction. My point is don't dismiss the reality of these things for currently seeming like contradictions. Right. Because I might get to heaven and God will be like, hey, dumbass, you missed this. And I think that's not only possible, it's probable. Like that's probably what's going to happen. And so I always use the term seeming contradiction to just say, don't dismiss these things because on the abstract level, they seem like contradictions.
Sure.
Whether they are ultimately or not, I don't know, precisely because of where I am in the story. I'm not at the end. I think 100%. And I guess with the Son not being, I think for me, that's another either or, and you're splicing it logically once again to say, if he's this, he's not that. And I think the whole beauty of the Trinity is that there's this intermingling there where they have their own distinct identities and roles, and yet they're also overcoming those things all the time. And so for me, when I say Jesus is becoming or the Son is becoming, I don't mean he began to exist, for he is always seemingly contradictorily one with the Father, such that this thing that's becoming is also eternal being. And so you can't say he began to exist. No, you have to come up with a new word, begotten, eternally begotten. Mm-hmm. And so for me, yes, your critique would work if I was trying to say that these things still made sense. My point is they don't, but at the abstract level, they don't have to because none of the theories make sense. Oneness can't make sense of manyness. Manyness can't make sense of oneness. Unity can't make sense of diversity. Diversity can't make sense of unity. None of them do at that level. So stop rejecting this for that. But I got a critique of how the Son isn't being because he is becoming. I don't know if it would apply at all.
Oh, I think I thought you were saying that the Son was becoming as opposed to the Father being, and since they're both in the Trinity as one God, that kind of shows they can be held at the same time. Since begotten is neither becoming nor being in its concept, do you think begotten means anything?
I guess if you think means something means it's clear.
What is its content when we say begotten, not made, consubstantial with the Father? What is that?
I think it's somewhere in the paradox or seeming contradiction of something that is eternally becoming or begin. I don't think it's one of those things you can put your finger on abstractly.
Okay, but you can know it. Or is it just a sort of word that, okay, so you can know
because being like the ultimate is one with becoming in Christ, such that finite things can know these things that are beyond us. And that's like that possibility is precisely what the Trinity allows.
Right.
And it can be mysterious and rational at the same time. I mean, that's the whole thing.
It's true.
At the abstract level.
Yeah, no, I'm with you I'm definitely with you on that. I just think the creed doesn't say, and he is becoming and being, and that's a mystery and it's rational. It says he's begotten, not made. And so I guess my point would be like, I think what I'm sensing is that I think on our sort of various diagnoses of like abstraction and sort of our intuitions about how that might relate to mystery and love and personal knowledge and intersubjectivity and stuff, I think we're really similar, if not almost on the same page with a lot of that. It seems to me. Maybe I'm wrong about that. But then I do think that at some point the conversation then has to just get into the content of theology, because there is where maybe other presuppositions, self-consciously or not, are operating. So like you and I have had a conversation before where I asked you, do you think it's possible that the Son could cease to be God or reject the Father in his otherness, and because he's other than the Father? I don't totally remember what you said, but if you were to say, for example, of like, yeah, then I would say, okay, I think we mean something different here. And I don't think we're like on the same, because you basically think the Trinity can be dissolved for some time since their otherness is there. Whereas I don't interpret otherness there with that kind of possibility, which I would actually regard as a deficiency. So like that, so I don't know where, I'm not saying you have to go there or anything, but I'm just saying that would be like, instead of just sticking on the level of identity and otherness or sameness and difference, it would have to get into the actual details and the content of the theology to see what that really means.
Would you be okay if that was possible at the abstract level, but actually encountering the man Jesus in the lived dialogical level? No, it wasn't.
Yes, but that's only because I think the abstract level isn't ever the real level. Yeah.
So,
right.
I mean, I wouldn't say that encountering Jesus, I think this man is capable of abandoning God at the lived level. So regardless of what I'd say at the abstract level, I wouldn't say that the Son has to go ditch the Father, but I do wonder if part of the power of the story is that in his otherness, the Son might have chosen otherwise. And I think this just comes down to whether we think will is a real thing. And what I would say is I am not a voluntarist in the classical sense. And I think part of my project is precisely an attempt to find a view of free will that isn't either voluntarism or determinism.
Steiner.
So, because for me, free will is a seeming contradiction. Free will would either, if free will comes from your nature or your experience or your past, then it's just sort of limited by that nature. And I'm not using nature in the theological sense here. Like I'm just using the sum of what you are. If it's restricted and determined by your nature, then you're not free because you're just the product of your nature. And so freedom cannot be the result of just the sum of your nature. And yet at the same time, if it's outside of your nature, then it wasn't you causing it. It's out of nothing. It's grounded in no prior essence or thing. Because it's not coming from the nature. And so this is the classical determinism or indeterminism thing. Indeterminism doesn't get you any closer to free will than determinism does, because you actually kind of need to say that in order for free will to work, it would have to be fully from your nature and also fully outside of your nature at the same time. Outside of your nature such that it wasn't forced by your nature, but also inside of your nature such that it's really you choosing it. And I think some people have tried to make that a rational mixture, like, oh, your nature is here, and then we're going to introduce some chance, and then it's you again, and that doesn't work as a rational mixture. There's no rational way to make sense of it. I've never heard any person say a rational thing about free will. Free will, for it to occur, would have to somehow be both within your nature and outside of your nature at the same time and in the same way, which is ridiculous, which is why for a long time I was kind of like, I'm not going to be someone who believes in free will. screw this, I'm going to do whatever I want, which is kind of ironic that you don't believe in free will, then you're going to do whatever you want. But in the sense that like I didn't think we were really accountable for any of those things because I didn't really believe free was rational to believe in. But part of the juxtaposing of it to this conversation with the Trinity and the origins of the universe was the realization that when you do look at the origins of the universe, at least in abstraction, the whole point is that somehow a timeless being began to act outside of its timeless nature to begin to create.
Right.
Because to avoid an infinite regress, you kind of have to make that timeless move, right? But then how does that entity begin to create the universe? You've reintroduced time into the equation. And some people say, no, he is eternally creating the universe. Okay, then if the effect is eternal, if the cause is eternal, the effect is eternal. Like this is all at the abstract level, of course. But then the point being that in order for a timeless being to begin to create the universe, he has to act both within and outside of his nature at the same time, which doesn't make sense. But the argument of the book is it makes as much sense as our own existence, because unless some sort of insanity happened at the beginning of all things, we wouldn't exist to talk about it. Mm-hmm. And that's where I get into the fact that I think the origins of the universe really are a free act. And my sense is a lot of people actually end up making similar moves, even if they don't call that free will, in order to make sense of how this temporal process descended from the eternal. They don't want to say God didn't cause it, but they also want it to be ex nihilo. And I think what we're essentially saying there is that neither voluntarism nor a deterministic pre-nature thing are adequate to the task. Somehow, free will is both acting within and outside of your nature at the same time, and such that God could act outside of the divine nature without altering absolute goodness, being, justice, and love at the heart of all existence. Now, that's again at the level of abstraction. Do I think, encountering the man Jesus, that this man will sin and violate those categories? No, I don't. But at the abstract level, I think free will makes as much sense as our own existence. And I think you don't have to choose voluntarism or classical theism, or, you don't have to make those choices. I think not choosing between those two things is as rational as any of the other options at the abstract level. But once we get down to reality, that's where it gets more interesting once again. So I think this is a false dichotomy in theology. I appreciate the critiques. I think the voluntarists are wrong on their own, but I think the other side is wrong on its own as well. I think it's both in between, in the middle.
I mean, I think it's only a false dilemma in theology if theology is similarly limited to abstraction, and I don't think it is. I guess there's two examples. One would be like to say, for example, well, if I meet sort of Jesus Christ, I don't think that person could even ever depart from the Father in a sort of act of rebellion or sin to separate himself from the Father's own will. And I know that more but abstractly that's possible. Well, but you have to interpret abstract possibility just as much as you have to interpret real possibility, because it isn't clear that just because something's abstractly possible, that it's really possible. And so if I meet Christ and I say, surely that Son of God could never, even in his very being, his person, he could never in his love for the Father separate from the Father. Then if I go back to Trinitarian theology and do the abstract possibility and say, but, since the Son is different than the Father, maybe he could. No, it just means you're no longer talking about the actual Son.
I think
you're talking about an abstract Son, but I'm not.
I think sorry, continue.
No,
I think you're making a correspondence between the dialogical, the dialectical, and the abstract that I feel like you had to sever earlier on, but now you're trying to reconnect it. And I know you wouldn't have said you were severing it, like he's bringing those things together. But I mean, I feel like in order to make your case and say that the two natures are in one person, you kind of had to say that the abstract logic, like, I don't think abstract logic works in your system in like a correspondence way. Like the critique you're making here of this, I feel like if I did the same thing with what you said, your whole thing would fall apart too. So I'm just, does that make sense? Not in like an aggressive way. No, it doesn't. But it also does to me. And it's both at the same time, Jordan. It's both.
I mean, it's that God himself is not simply his nature. And Jesus is not simply reducible to his two natures. And I'm not reducible to my soul or my body. And that's
Are
just
you saying that?
Yeah. Yeah,
So
I am.
we are our natures, and we're more than our natures.
No, we're irreducible. Well, yeah, we have natures, and we have to have natures in order. I mean, that's Chalcedonian right there. But I wouldn't characterize that as the quote unquote ability to work against my nature. I think that has to be distinguished. You can go beyond a nature, but not against it. Those are different things. So, like, I don't think that the Son. I don't think it's even a virtual condition of the Son's otherness from the Father to be able, quote unquote, able to sever himself from the Father. I don't think that that's actually a part of his otherness. In fact, we could abstract about it and create an abstract possibility, but the abstract possibility is only something that we construct from the abstract juxtaposition of two concepts that are never the Father or the Son as such. They're ones we've assigned to them, right?
Were you done? I want to make a very Jordan Daniel Wood kind of move and
That's
ask,
my favorite kind.
When he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Might we just take him at his word? And I get that that's quoting a psalm of victory. It's not totally, but I have often wondered if we were going to just sit with the event and not immediately try to dismiss it away with our categories, if Jesus actually becoming sin, and sin being, separation from God or whatever, and him becoming that, may actually mean that, such that I'm not just taking my categories and imposing it on him, but maybe this might allow us to actually hear some of the story and actually listen to it for the first time instead of trying to make sense of it immediately, which everyone terrified has to do with those verses.
Yeah.
But sorry, good.
Well,
but I also think once I
ahead.
enter into the theological and the historical theological, that's where you can beat the shit out of me. I don't want to go there. So, because I think,
hang on that. I get on that specific point, John, that Bulgakov does very much go there in Sociology of Death.
Right. Yeah, he does.
So, yeah.
I mean, but this is the funny thing though, because it's like, even the way you frame that is like, well, either we sort of go with the story and the story just sort of says, he's derelict, or we do the thing and immediately make sense of it. But of course, just reverting to the narrative is just another way to make sense of it immediately. The real interesting thing is to say, he became sin and a curse for us, and he had no sin. And that's actually what it says. It says he who knew no sin, who had no sin, became sin and a curse for us. If I just section that out narratively, actually that's totally rationalist. It's just narrative rationality. Oh, first he wasn't sinful, then he went into the otherness phase and really severed himself, which was always possible. And then he returns to his sort of unity with the Father. That's not somehow mysterious. That's actually very intuitive and very rational. It's just the opposite sort of rationality to a different kind of rationality, which would remove it from the narrative altogether and say, actually, that was a play acting performance thing, and really he's just speaking in the voice of Adam, fallen Adam, or whatever, like a lot of the fathers do. So I actually think both of those are just opposite but equally rationalist options. Instead, what I'd want to say is that he became sin and a curse for us precisely as the sin he became is never his own. The dereliction that he suffered is never his own. The dissevering that he suffered was never his own, because that's not possible for the Son of God who loves the Father always and everywhere. But no, it's not. I don't think it is. No. If at that point, because if it is possible for the Son to sever himself as insofar as evil sort of resists good, then we are just basically saying we're basically thinking of the incarnation as a mythology where first he was this condition, then he took up this one. But a mythology is always a rationality as well.
Perhaps my point would have real traction against someone who thinks that humans, as connected and one with God, can actually be separated from him fully.
Yeah, there's a part there.
I think
right.
you as a universalist, I'm just like hitting a brick wall here. But I think, but I think my point there might have had something to say against a lot of other theologians.
Yeah,
but let me get to the deeper heart of this, though, which I think was your statement. You can't go beyond your nature. You can go beyond it, but you can't go against it. And I guess for me, this comes to the heart not just of Christology and freedom, but again to the origins of the universe, because I consistently have no idea how this definition of nature is allowing the timeless to create the temporal. And even if you want to say it's the infinite creating the finite, it's still, I think it breaks down in terms of abstract logic. I think the category of nature not being able to go beyond itself leads you basically to Advaita Vedanta. I think you just have an absolute oneness. I don't even think you can have mode, because I think the attempt to distinguish into mode the nature and to have it manifest in particular ways is already doing something to it, in the same way that I think the timeless beginning to create is doing something to it. I think if we're going to stick to this definition of nature that's fully rational and just what it is and nothing beyond itself or against itself, I think you end up with absolute oneness. And as soon as you try to clarify that in any way, you've already brought in the manyness, the becoming, the difference, and then you've ended up with both. You've ended up with those things overlapping in precisely the way that I say they always overlap. And if that's the case, then why can't you say the sort of crazy things that I'm saying? Because I think all of us are saying it. We're just pretending we're not, and pretending that I'm the mysterious one and we're not. I think everyone's got this mystery. It's just where they locate it. And I think even in the definition of nature, I just think we're smuggling in the mystery there at the beginning of all things and then saying it makes sense later on. But the mystery's still there. It's there at every step.
Yeah. I mean, where you locate mystery is a judgment, though, and that can be evaluated. So I think that matters quite a bit. Like the fact that everybody has mystery isn't all that interesting. I mean, of course, most people do, even scientists. I mean,
you're not that interesting, Jonathan. Thanks, Jordan.
no, it's not that.
But they're repetitions of similar, if not identical, mysteries, though, is the thing. I think that would be
right. But even to say it's a repetition of the same pattern of mystery is, in some ways, distances yourself from the content of any particular instance of that mystery. Mm-hmm. So let's get into the details of Christology. That's where you would have to go if you, from my perspective, right? My perspective is, yes, if you're talking about God as just sort of this nature that's eternally in his aseity and he's sort of immutable, and then God acts ad extra, and then we ask the question, at what point is that, and doesn't that introduce becoming and all that, and how does that relate to his being and all that? Sure, of course, I'm with you on that. Like, I'm not I don't think it's sufficient just to be like sort of God. The classical theist God is sort of like solves it if you just really think about those terms hard enough, right?
Well, I have Orthodox Jewish friends that they won't affirm the Trinity, obviously, but they do concede that God is a multi-unity. Right. They just think that Trinity is an arbitrary way of establishing that, and they also believe in Tzimtzum, which is the withdrawal of God in order to create. So it's like
Space God.
Right.
So we got there. We got there. Sorry, go ahead.
So that's
No, but for me, it's like since Christ is a person and he's only his two natures, like person is already beyond nature, but person is not arbitrary.
Right.
It's determinate. It's actually more determinate than any apprehension of nature. And so I guess that's the part where I feel like I want to get to a positive, accessible knowing, which isn't just a kind of concession of like, hey, on the abstract level, we're going to juxtapose the two. And we all sort of implicitly and maybe unreflectively accept the conclusion anyway, but nobody knows how we get there. But it's just as rational as any other thing because here we are, and it's like, that works again for a certain goal. I can see how that would work for a certain goal, but like in Christology, that's not my reasoning. My reasoning isn't, well, I kind of need a God human, and it's tough to see how a God and a human can fit together because the two natures don't seem to match up, but let's just sort of posit that. It's like, no, I mean, if the incarnation was the revelation, not just of the negation and how it must be sort of stalled out and juxtaposed, but was actually the positive disclosure that the truth and the logos of all things is a person, then that means there's a determinacy to the person, just as there's determinacy to any person. In fact, maybe a hyperdeterminacy, so that knowing Christ is not something that just doesn't make sense. It would only not make sense if the sum total of the real is abstraction, but it isn't. Since it isn't, it can totally make sense. And it's not in the same way. It's not that it makes sense. It doesn't make sense in the same way. In fact, emphatically not. It does not make sense from the perspective of abstraction, although abstraction's not negated in the going beyond. In the knowing of the person, in the 1 Corinthians 13:12, face to face, know as I am known. That doesn't negate the abstraction, but it relativizes it in light of the whole. It does relativize it.
I guess I just feel like my account had all that positivity. There is the positivity, and it is embodied and lived and dialogical in that sense, that like what I am knowing is a person who is also beyond me, who is genuinely other, and yet like myself enough united that I can know them. And I don't feel like I started at the abstraction and then worked down to that encounter. I think the encounter is very much self and other, and that those categories being overcome, but also reinstated in other ways. And it's a bit of both. And I think that those questions don't arise if I'm just having a conversation with someone I love. But I would also say that if we're getting back to actual, the real and what we actually encounter, I think freedom is a huge part of that phenomenological experience. Yeah. I don't think anyone's wanting to insert freedom into the equation for philosophical reasons, because philosophy is basically the death of free will, in my opinion. Free will is a basic, I think it's almost a properly basic belief. I think most people are so upset and baffled when they have it questioned at 10 or 11 or whatever. They spend a few years really frustrated. Or, I think most of us want to believe free will in the same way we want to believe that morality isn't totally relative. I think it's not an abstraction. I think it's a grounded thing for all of us. And I'm starting with that. Go ahead, Nate.
It's actually something you can only hold as an abstraction. You cannot, like, in terms of in your life as you live it, it's necessary. If you say you have no free will, then you're going to live out a performative contradiction, because you can't actually live into that. You can only declare that at the level of abstraction and propositions. So
I think that's a great thank you, Nate. I think it's totally the thing is that I think, like, my actual lived experience, free will is just undeniable. And I think my encounter with other persons, without assuming that, would just break down. Now, at the abstract level, maybe I don't need to articulate it, but I would say, okay, but once you go to that level, the critiques of freedom apply to all of the worldviews. I get that free will doesn't make sense, but no one else's accounts make sense either, and it makes as much sense as everyone else's. But in the embodied, the lived, the incarnational, the dialectical, whatever the hell we want to call it, the real, I think freedom is just there. And I don't want to say that it's in the Bible, like Jesus was free. Like, I don't think there's this American, like, freedom, Jesus. But I do think that even in encountering him, I struggle to make sense of a lot of it if I don't see these as free entities who, and I don't think they would have had the articulated view of free will I've just suggested. But my sense is that historic ancient people assumed free will, even if they never made it explicit. I think it's just embedded deeply in all of our encounters, even with Christ.
I think, I think that's fine. I'm really trying to think through, like, where, like, I would agree with all that. I do think, and maybe here I'm a little closer to David. I think that freedom is not the only thing that's interesting about our experience of free will, but intentionality and self-consciousness is fundamental. And so it isn't like the fact that I'm not coerced or that I can act, quote unquote, out of my nature is one thing, but the intentionality behind it, let alone the intentionality of God's free act of creation behind that, and whether or not God can know, like, is competent to know how to fulfill the intention that began the thing in the first place. Tabling all that, I would just say, like, I think maybe what I'm saying is that while I appreciate the critique of abstract opposition, and this is just as rational as anything else, I think that's important again for certain goals. I do think at some point what's really needed is just an actual critique of abstraction itself. That's one way I would actually say what Hegel's doing, for example. But then once you undertake that, what you realize is actually freedom doesn't exist anywhere as a concept. It does not exist anywhere as I apprehend as abstract conditions for the possibility of freedom. The interesting thing is the actual free person making actual free choices in actual concrete situations, all of which, or I say none of which, can actually be accounted for by abstract conditions. And that's why we say things like prudence or wisdom. This is the insight to know, but that's actually not knowing. That's not a failure to come up to abstractions level. It's actually knowing further, more deeply, and more exactly than abstraction ever could. But that's a critique now of abstraction, not a sort of that's more than just a negative one. That's a positive one that says even this is why phenomenology came after, after the movements of the late 19th and early 20th century in philosophy. That's why that came. Right after Husserl, like the intentionality, you pair that with the sort of the bracketing off thing, and what you realize is they're turning not simply to the abstract conditions that the understanding spins out and then has these sort of negations, but they're paying attention to the conditions of this phenomenon here and now, and the phenomenon of perceiving phenomenon here and now, and the phenomenon of myself perceiving this phenomenon here and now. Like that's what that is, right? And whatever you make of that whole movement and its various branches, I just think that's another way to go, such that you still have the positivity and determinacy, even as you're critiquing abstraction and going beyond it through that critique. So I'm wanting to go there.
Yeah, I think maybe there's a general sense in which I would just be like, yes, your job as the historical theologian is not my job. I'm a philosopher of religion or a philosophical theologian. And so there's a sense in which, coming back to the real, I think my theories point beyond themselves to, hey, the actual person of Christ and the lived experience. And I'm comfortable with just saying that.
Yeah.
I'd also say, maybe I'm mishearing, but that some of the lived experience of freedom isn't just the voluntaristic sense, but that it actually has a nature and something it's directed toward.
Yeah.
And what I would say is my abstract notion of free will wasn't voluntaristic, but required something that was both within and beyond its nature at the same time. And so the phenomenological encounter with the nature of who I am as being essential to that will that is encountered phenomenologically would be exactly what I would expect. And it's precisely that encounter that's perplexing, because it's me making the choices, and yet I'm not restricted by my meanness. It's my nature and more than my nature. And that's where that thought encountered phenomenologically in reality is what then leads to the abstraction of how do I make sense of those two things. But I think freedom has both of those things, such that I think I hold someone accountable for their actions. I don't hold their parents accountable, but I also recognize that their actions didn't come out of nowhere. They came from a nature. Mm-hmm. And so these are all the puzzles.
But they didn't come from a nature. They came from a person. That's the part I don't really get. The person is already beyond the nature that it is.
Yeah.
So maybe I'm not using nature in the way that you've been using it. But sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no. So that might be a helpful, because that's the part. It's like the thing is, if you're not using nature that way, then maybe it does it reframes the idea that, well, on the one hand, free will requires me to act within my nature or according to my nature, and also beyond the nature. Whereas I think the phenomenon of intersubjective knowing and intending and ultimately love isn't really best captured in that way. I mean, it's not like I'm both going according to my nature and beyond my nature, because the moving beyond is always already determined by the beloved, who is not abstract. Well, and so I don't see that. So there's an actual determinacy to the beyond, which is determined by the determination of the act of the will, which is the actual other person, right?
Yeah. So this is why Steiner is such a unique voice on this topic of freedom, because in the philosophy of freedom, like essentially to like really boil Steiner's point down in philosophy of freedom, he ties freedom to creativity and love. Like that's what freedom, that's what freedom is creativity and love. And those things are things that are like it. Of course, they're not tied to natures, because those are things that can only come out of persons,
right,
and are not generated by natures.
Yeah. Well, but then again, creativity is precisely creating, and it's making more out of what was there. I think by nature, I just mean the totality of what a person is, and that you can factor in nature, nurture, whatever it is that you think that determines this entity's choice. That's what I mean by nature. And your choices have to be made in your nature, or they're not your choices. And they're random, they're chaotic. They occur out of a void. And yet they also need to not just be limited by your nature, or else they weren't free. They're determined by it.
So I have
that doesn't make sense.
So
but again,
but it could make sense if you just take the fact that whatever that my choices, or say my desires, are generated by me. I'll just say that, sort of nature or person, just by me. And also they find their termination in the other, like say in the act of love. I could simply interpret that as what I initially thought of as an absolute distinction in terms of actually thinking the abstraction of other and sameness really determined the possibilities between me and the beloved. I can actually see that maybe it's just that you already included me and I included you all along, and my initial attempts to abstract that difference were incomplete and wrong. And so I don't necessarily think there's an absolute contradiction there at all. And I don't think there's a phenomenological contradiction either. So I guess I don't feel that kind of antinomy at that point.
I have a favorite line from Tomberg that I reference often. And Tomberg says that the only genuinely free acts that ever occur are impossible things, because anything that is not impossible just happens according to nature. So for Tomberg, like a free act actually has to at least seemingly come from beyond your nature. So he cites something like Jesus saying, love your enemies. Like if you're actually able to love your enemies, that's a free act, because in accordance to nature, that's impossible.
I like these little interjections, Nate, because they feel like they're falling more in my direction. Like not every time, but like it feels like, so just keep going. Just keep going.
I mean, it's in some ways this replays some of the things I've said to David, where it's like, I mean, again, I would just say what that's evidence of is that your initial apprehension of your own nature was itself too small. So actually what you perceive in your impossible free act is that you were always already more than you thought you were. So I don't see it going beyond a nature, in fact, although it's going beyond your abstract conception of what was possible for that nature. Yes.
If you want to redefine person to include a view of freedom that is both within and beyond their nature at the same time, such as both within and beyond their nature is now their nature, then I'm on board with that semantic move.
And that then amounts to a critique of what I thought was possible simply because it was abstractly possible. Then
okay, but then we're looking at very different possibilities for the person, for God, and that'll get into questions around because I mean, I don't want to bring up universalism now because we're past our time, but like,
and also we'd be ganging up on you because I'm also a universalist.
Yeah, I know.
Save that for the real live thing. That way people to draw people.
Yeah, no, what? End it here, man. End it here and just be like, you don't get the rest of the conversation. But no, but if you want to just define person as both that which is nature and beyond limitation of its nature, then I'm fine with that move. And for me, that is what the personal is. It's precisely that characteristic at the origins of the universe that makes me describe it as a personal free act, because I don't think anything but a personal free act could have originated the occurrence of a temporal effect from a timeless cause that was still rooted in it and not just out of nothing. I think it's by definition a personal free act. So for me, the person isn't the nature and then they spring away from their personhood. Personhood is the free, like, is precisely the dance that we're talking about here. So
So let me
But
share
then that
this.
leads more to my system, so I don't know where we're going. Go ahead.
I don't think it does.
I have this little paragraph from Walsh that I want to share. So he says this. He says, it is not just that the person is a being. The person is the apex at which the being of being is disclosed. St. Thomas's metaphysics is based on the understanding that every being seeks to disclose itself, to communicate what it is. But he does not ask how he knows this, and as a consequence, it never becomes clear that being is personal. The person provides the model of being without really showing why. To do that would require the enlargement of perspective to include what it means to be a person. Then it would be seen that the person is not an event within being, but the event of being. As that which comes from what is not, the person exemplifies the emergence of being. We can ask about the source of being because we ourselves are engaged in the advent of being.
Mm-hmm. So this is why I would just say I don't actually think we've fully really adequately described what freedom is. If we just say it's like on the level of or personhood for that matter, if we just say, well, it's sort of the thing, it's the movement or the act by which you sort of at once it sort of has its origin in your nature, but also goes beyond your nature, because it never just goes beyond your nature. It always goes towards something determinate. I never desire just desire. I don't desire nothing. I always desire something that is, yes, distinct from me, but by the very fact I can form it as an object of my desire, it's also within me always already. So I think the juxtaposition. So this is what I mean by a critique of the abstract possibilities. It has to come to a critique of of abstraction itself, the thing that generated the two abstract possibilities that seem to be in tension. At some point, you just have to say the personal resolves that, not because it's some other thing and we're just at a different level, like a pancake thing, but because it actually, in its unfolding, shows that it has always already been more than any of our abstractions about ourselves. And so, and precise, not just as a according to and beyond, but a beyond towards something. It's never towards nothing.
Well, if you're kind of saying that what is beyond your nature and your nature are actually kind of the same thing at the end of the day, that's very much what I am saying. Because I'm not saying it's one and then the other in a mixture. I'm saying it's both. And perhaps you can word that at the abstract logical level that I'm saying, or you can just say that we realize that they never were in reality different. But I think there's a correspondence in some way between what we're saying here. But I think the interesting thing is that then if what this person is can be something that's a nature and beyond its nature, but the beyond its nature is never fully beyond its nature, then I think we're entertaining definitions of freedom that I don't think they contradict what classical theism wants to say, but I think they're broadening the frame in perhaps, I don't know if it sounds like in a way that you also want to broaden it. And so like I would also say, for me precisely what the contradiction is that which is outside is also within, and that I don't know where the one begins and the other ends, but they also are different, but they're not. And that make like at a lived level, that just works. You don't need to parse it out. But at the abstract level, I feel like you're just saying also, once again, what I'm saying. I think maybe the Hegelian aspect is that you feel like having said it, it's now rational at the abstract level or just at the dialogical level?
No, I think the Hegelian moment is the need to critique abstraction itself. So again, I never just want the outside. So like I perceive freedom both comes from within and it's also without, and maybe in some way they're the same. The problem is there is no single act of freedom that I've ever experienced in my entire life that actually fulfills or simply those conditions. I never want the outside. I want that person or that delight or that pleasure or that temptation. That's a determinate presentation in the realm of intentionality. So the intentionality isn't actually adequately parsed by something without and something within, and they're sort of together. That's too abstract still. Yeah. Freedom only ever is more determinate than any of that in actual lived existence. And so that's the part I want to go to and say, if we're going to give a full account of freedom, we can't give such a general account that it actually adequately describes no actual instance of freedom.
Well, to make this more specific, would what you just said mean that even the critiques that people make of voluntarism are too limited?
In one aspect, yeah. So like one way I would maybe characterize what I'm after, and I think that you can find in the Philokalia, that tradition, and Maximian tradition, is you can find an intellectualist view of freedom, or rationalist view of freedom, or rational freedom, like say the way David does it in That All Shall Be Saved or whatever. You can find that. They do hold that. But they also hold something else, which is the primordial sort of possibility of error. And error is still presented to you as a determinate thing. It doesn't change the act of freedom, even if it's a sin. So it still respects the idea that there is no free act that's sort of just indeterminate, which was the original sort of condition of the abstract within and without. Indeterminate, within and without what? Is there an object within? Is there an object without? What are we talking about? And so I think that so it still does that, and yet it does still kind of make room for this spiritual life of oscillation. And now I got to do prudence, and I've got to do discernment within my soul, and all the really personal stuff that unfolds. And so they haven't really given up on a view of on one level, they haven't given up the idea that there is no such thing as freedom that's not ultimately rational, but they simultaneously admit that nothing right now it corresponds simply to the ultimately rational. And so where we're at right now is not actually freedom. What we experience is something like a diminished or muted freedom, which is to say something less than true freedom. And so that's the more interesting thing that corresponds to our phenomenological experience of freedom now. But then also that freedom is the very basis upon which we've created these abstract conditions within and without. So I don't think any abstraction based on that kind of current experience is necessarily sufficient for a full accounting of freedom. And that's why I said earlier perfection. Like I want to go to that's why I want the eschatological. And I don't think of the eschatological as just something that's on the horizon, not yet here, because in Christ, the end of the ages have come upon us, which means that whatever is eschatologically real is at least somehow partially revealed or glimpsed in the middle in Christ. And so the fact that he has a natural will, not a gnomic will, shows me something about freedom and its determinacy that abstract considerations won't, for example.
Well, I know we're running out of time here, and I sound like
we got 2 more hours.
No, I just really want to emphasize how deeply annoyed I am that no matter where we are in life, you're always just beating me up for making abstract castles in the clouds.
I always say the first half we're together.
No, whether you're on a Wittgenstein kick or a Hegel crick, you're always just tearing down my castles in the clouds, and I just.
What you don't know, John, is that people have been feeding me drafts of your project over the years, and I actually determine what my next fad is going to be based on how useful I will think it'll be in my next attack.
I know that you are joking, and that's not true, but it still makes me feel affirmed somehow, and I'm gonna hold on to it deeply. So thank you.
No, it's wonderful.
This has been a great warm-up. I'm
worn out.
On stage in North Carolina, we'll have about half this length of time. So we got to refine this. But yeah, it was great. Yeah. Thank you guys for joining me.
Of course. Thanks, Nate. Good to see you, John.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, good to see you. Third time this week.